girlfriend Emily and I had been planning a weekend getaway for months. The Airbnb we'd chosen was a beautiful cottage nestled deep in the woods, promising serenity and isolation. Little did we know that our escape would soon turn into a nightmarish ordeal that would forever haunt our dreams. As we drove up to the cottage, our excitement knew no bounds. It was a charming little place, surrounded by tall trees, with a tranquil lake shimmering in the distance. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over the landscape. We couldn't have asked for a more perfect setting. The cottage itself was straight out of a fairy tale, with its rustic exterior and a quaint porch adorned with rocking chairs. We had seen the photos online, but they didn't do justice to the true beauty of the place. It felt like we were stepping into a storybook. But as the night wore on, a sense of unease began to creep over us. It started with a soft tapping sound on the window, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. Emily and I exchanged puzzled glances, our laughter fading into apprehension. I went to the window and peered outside, expecting to see a tree branch tapping against the glass. But there was nothing there, just the inky darkness of the woods. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination playing tricks on me, but the unease persisted. As we settled into bed, the tapping sound continued, growing more persistent and unsettling. It was as though something or someone was trying to get our attention, beckoning us into the night. Unable to ignore it any longer, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured outside, my heart pounding with each step. Emily insisted on coming with me, not willing to stay alone in the eerie silence of the cottage. We scored the area around the cottage, our flashlight beams piercing the darkness. There was still no sign of anything that could explain the tapping. It felt as though the very woods were playing tricks on us, whispering secrets we couldn't comprehend. As we returned inside, a feeling of dread settled over us. It was then that we noticed something was amiss. The front door was slightly ajar. Panic gripped us, and we realized that we hadn't left it open when we went outside. Our serene getaway had taken a sinister turn. We cautiously entered the cottage, our senses on high alert. The warmth and coziness that had greeted us earlier had now turned into an oppressive silence, broken only by the pounding of our hearts. And then, out of the darkness, a menacing voice rang out, sending a shiver down our spines. "You shouldn't have come here," it hissed, a chilling threat in its tone. We froze, our eyes wide with terror. 3 shadowy figures emerged from the darkness, their faces concealed by masks. They were dressed in dark clothing, carrying weapons that gleamed ominously in the dim light. It was clear that these were no ordinary intruders. They were thugs, criminals who had invaded our sanctuary. "Give us everything you've got," one of them demanded, his voice cold and unforgiving. Emily and I exchanged terrified glances as we handed over our valuables, our hands trembling. But the thugs weren't satisfied with just our possessions. They ransacked the cottage, turning it into a scene of chaos and destruction. The sound of shattering glass and splintering wood echoed through the night, a painful reminder of the violation of our peaceful retreat. As they continued their ruthless search, their leader turned to us with a malevolent grin. "Now tell us where you keep the rest of your valuables," he demanded, his eyes filled with malice. Emily and I exchanged desperate looks, but we had nothing more to give. We had been stripped of our possessions, our sense of security, and now, even our dignity. The thugs grew increasingly agitated, their frustration mounting. It was then that I noticed a glimmer of hope, a faint glow coming from the direction of our car. The car's headlights were flickering on and off, casting eerie shadows on the cottage. In the chaos, I had accidentally left the car keys on the kitchen table. It seemed like a stroke of luck, a chance to escape this nightmare. With a swift motion, I grabbed the keys and pressed the car's panic button. The blaring alarm pierced the night, shattering the thugs' composure. They fled into the darkness, leaving behind the wreckage of our once idyllic getaway. We wasted no time. Emily and I jumped into the car and sped away from the cottage, leaving behind the haunting memories of that fateful night. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest police station, where we reported the harrowing incident. Our serene weekend getaway had transformed into a nightmarish ordeal that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. We had survived the Airbnb Nightmare, but it was a memory that would forever be etched in our minds. The sun was setting over the tranquil countryside as my friends and I arrived at the picturesque Airbnb nestled deep in the woods. We had booked it for my best friend Sarah's bridal shower, aiming for a weekend of relaxation and celebration. Little did we know that the serene setting would soon turn into a nightmare beyond our wildest fears. As we stepped out of our cars, the place seemed idyllic. A charming cabin surrounded by tall pine trees with a bubbling brook nearby painted the perfect backdrop for our festivities. I had planned every detail meticulously, determined to make it a weekend Sarah would never forget. We settled in, unpacking bags filled with decorations, snacks, and drinks. The air was thick with excitement, laughter, and the promise of a memorable weekend ahead. We decorated the living room with streamers and balloons, transforming the cabin into a bridal paradise. Sarah's smile was radiant as she marveled at the setup. As night fell, we gathered around a cozy fire pit in the backyard, sharing stories and toasting to Sarah's upcoming wedding. The stars above shone brilliantly, and the sounds of the forest surrounded us, creating a sense of tranquility. It was the perfect evening, or so it seemed. As the night wore on, we retreated inside, ready to call it a day. We had a big day planned for tomorrow, full of bridal games, spa treatments, and heartfelt speeches. But it wasn't long before we began to sense that something was amiss. I was the first to notice it, a faint rustling sound coming from outside the cabin. At first, I dismissed it as the wind rustling the trees. However, it persisted, growing louder and more unsettling. My friends exchanged uneasy glances, their laughter fading. We huddled together, our eyes scanning the darkness beyond the cabin's windows. Then, the rustling grew louder, accompanied by a soft, eerie whispering. It sounded like someone was lurking in the woods, just beyond our sight. My heart raced as I realized that our perfect getaway had taken a chilling turn. Suddenly, the cabin's lights flickered and dimmed. Panic surged through us as we fumbled for our phones, only to discover that the signal was weak at best. The isolation that had seemed so inviting during the day was now a terrifying reality. And then, as if on cue, we heard a sinister voice coming from the shadows. "Sarah," it whispered, a haunting, distorted version of her name. We froze in fear, unable to comprehend what was happening. Sarah clung to me, trembling, tears in her eyes. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling as I grabbed a fireplace poker for protection. The voice didn't respond, but the rustling and whispers continued, growing closer. It was as if the forest itself was conspiring against us. Just as I was about to lose my nerve and call the police, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was a man, his face obscured by a hood, but there was something chillingly familiar about him. As he stepped into the dim light of the cabin, my heart sank. It was Sarah's ex-boyfriend, Mark. Mark and Sarah had a tumultuous relationship, and their breakup had been messy and painful. We had thought he was out of her life for good, but here he was in the middle of the woods on the night of her bridal shower. "Sarah, you can't marry him," Mark hissed, his eyes filled with a menacing intensity. "I won't let you." Sarah was paralyzed with fear, her face drained of color. The rest of us huddled together, our hearts pounding as we watched this unexpected intruder. "What do you want?" I demanded, trying to muster as much courage as I could. Mark didn't respond, his gaze locked on Sarah. He stepped closer, his presence suffocating. Suddenly, with a burst of adrenaline, I swung the fireplace poker at Mark, hitting him square in the chest. He stumbled back, gasping for air, and then disappeared into the darkness. We heard him retreating, the rustling growing fainter until it was no more than a distant echo. We locked all the doors and windows, barricading ourselves inside. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, each creak of the cabin sending shivers down our spines. We couldn't sleep, couldn't relax, haunted by the thought of Mark lurking in the shadows, waiting for another chance to strike. Dawn finally broke, and we dared to venture outside, but Mark was nowhere to be found. We gathered our things, abandoning our plans for the bridal shower, and left the Airbnb behind, forever scarred by the night's events. To this day, we don't know how Mark found us in that remote cabin, or what he intended to do. But one thing was certain. Our idyllic Airbnb getaway had turned into a terrifying nightmare, one we would never forget, and it cast a long shadow over Sarah's impending wedding.